All right. Well, firstly, I want to thank you for doing this interview. I'm sure you're fairly busy, so I thank you taking the time out of your day to answer some questions from a college student.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah. All right. So for people that are going to be watching this, could you just give a quick background on who you are and your specialty in social studies?
Yeah, hello everybody. My name is Mark Shubert. I am the founder and chair of Tarpeia. We also go by Amending America. We are an educational nonprofit, and we're focusing on curating educational material, mostly on the college level, regarding American history and civics. And so hopefully we can get a little bit more into that in this interview about what's wrong with education and also what can we do to try to fix it, more specifically when it comes to American history and civics.
Of course. Awesome. So yeah, no, kind of building off what you said. So yeah, no, firstly, we're just going to generally talk about like social studies in the United States. Generally, how do we define it? How do we assess that decline? So yeah, no, starting with the first question, something we discussed prior, is exactly how do we assess the decline of social studies in the United States? What are the certain guidelines that determine if a subject is declining or in growth?
Yeah, this is a very important topic that I think gets, I guess, blown over by anyone who's doing research. Like they just look at the charts, the numbers, the statistics, and like, oh, American history education is on the decline. And I always bring up the question, well, how are we measuring those metrics? What does that mean exactly to say American history is in decline? Does that mean that fewer people know when George Washington's birthday is? Is that what it means? Like, what are we actually testing to determine the decline? And of course, there's many different metrics, many different statistics that show different time periods throughout American education. I always bring up a paper that was written by a commission of educational professors back in 1944 that they were also concerned of the decline of American history, and looking at how they measure that decline versus how we measure that decline is completely different, especially ever since important educational bills like No Child Left Behind, that act passed by Bush Jr., that mostly focuses on increasing math and science, not necessarily the arts, not necessarily American history as well. So when we talk about improving education or the decline of educational standards, it's kind of wild. There's so many different metrics, and everyone's using different numbers and different means of testing. And so I want to go a little bit further into that. Like, what does it mean to be educated in American history? Does that mean knowing, being able to recite all of the presidents? Like, I can recite all the presidents. Does that mean anything? Is like, that's just trivia. So are we really concerned about trivia being the main way that we measure the decline of American history? I don't think that should be the case. I don't think that trivia should be the foundation of American history education. Instead, it should be something more meaningful than just trivia. Oh, like, all the presidents. Congratulations. I think a preschooler could learn all that if they really tried. But what's more important than just knowing the presidents is, what are their campaign agendas? What do they promise during their campaigns? What were their platforms? What party were they in? And did the rest of the party agree with them? What were some of the executive orders or congressional bills that they signed into law? What were some of the important Supreme Court decisions or some of the new justices that they sworn in? That information gives a lot more important context to just, oh, I know George Washington was the first president or John Adams was the second president. That kind of information is just trivia. So we shouldn't be all too concerned about trivia. We should be more concerned about actual politics, actual history that is meaningful, that we can actually learn lessons from. So that's my introductory answer to that question.
Oh yeah, no, and I 100% agree with you. I think that through history and civics, you're not just learning about these events that are happening, but also kind of developing skills of like critical thinking, for example, understanding what are the motives behind certain actions, how are these created, how have these left an impact. I feel like the information that you're leaving civics and history classes with isn't who is the president of who are the 50 presidents of the United States, or what are these certain bills that are passed. What they are is precisely, why were these created? How do these still impact us today? And how can we learn from our past what we can use to improve our future?
Absolutely.
All right. So, moving right along, kind of going into more of the specifics here. I understand that with No Child Left Behind, standardized testing became majorly significant in school since then. The focus shifted away from more critical thinking, hands-on activities to more standardized testing. So I generally want to ask you, where do you see that correlation between standardized testing and history within that education, but also just general social studies field?
Well, I definitely think that it goes into my previous answer, which is mostly about trivia, like knowing when the Boston Tea Party happened. Like, yeah, knowing the date might be somewhat important, but you don't actually learn anything from the specific day. You learn from like the causes of the Boston Tea Party and what were the effects of the Boston Tea Party. How did Parliament react? How did the British the royal governors react? How did the patriots react? Were they all in supportive of the Boston Tea Party, throwing away millions of dollars in today's money worth of property damage? Some of our patriotic founders were against it. And so knowing more of the context has been lost from standardized testing. Now, that isn't to say that kind of context was there in the first place. I don't think education was all that great even before the standardized testing. It's not to the standard that I am working towards with my charity, but it is definitely worse than it was before. There's just so many people today who have less of an understanding of American history, because trivia, you don't really get to, unless you like practice every single day, like recite trivia all the time, you can easily forget it. So not only are we focusing on something that isn't really that meaningful, it's also very forgetful. So people aren't even retaining a lot of the information that they're taught in school. And what's worse, they're being taught less of it because, again, the No Child Left Behind focused on math and science, which I'm not, dissing math and science, but focusing on American history. So we're being taught less, and then what we're being taught isn't that important. And then what is actually taught is also not retained after the semester. So there's a lot of things going wrong with history education right now. Standardized testing is part of it. The expectations, the curriculum in the classrooms are a part of it. The lack of encouragement and support to teachers is another part of it. There's like so many different facets to this problem that hopefully we can solve, at least with the work that I'm trying to do.
Oh yeah, no, of course. So, moving right along into this. So generally, like you were talking about, how math and science, for example, have kind of taken the head on in terms of what schools prioritize. So how would you describe kind of like how is history valued by schools compared to other things such as reading or STEM classes, more or less?
Well, compared to those, history education is not treated well, or there's no high expectations to actually learn something. It's like with math and science. I mean, a lot of people don't use the Pythagorean theorem every single day, but having a basic understanding of math helps you with your personal finances. It can help you with small personal projects at home, and that's good and all. But for American history, and especially civics, that has much more of a profound impact on our lives because it impacts the way we vote. And the way we vote impacts government, and government impacts every aspect of our life. It impacts the amount of taxes that we have to pay. It impacts the regulations on the economy. It impacts whether or not we go into foreign conflicts. which can cost even more money and potentially lives from the United States. And it also impacts our social cohesion, whether or not we view each other as compatriots or as political rivals. So although math and science is more practical in your everyday use, history and civics, which to me, history and civics are one and the same,
Mhm.
that has a far more important impact in the long run than knowing how to do the Pythagorean theorem. And so I'm not sure what the true interest of something like No Child Left Behind was trying to achieve. Well, what was their goal? I haven't been given a clear answer on that, even though I've listened to George Bush's speeches. He gives like very oversimplified, generic answer, like, oh, improving education and stuff like that. That's not a real answer as to like
Mhm.
what exactly what are the actual items, the goals that we're trying to achieve with this policy of basically deteriorating history education. And so that's my answer to that question.
Gotcha. Okay. I'd agree with you with that. So going into that last question about this general first half is generally just when a student does leave high school or college or whatever, and they don't receive this necessary historic learning or civic learning, how can this detriment impact someone that may not be as well informed in civics or as history?
Could you repeat that?
Oh yeah, no, of course. So basically, when a student does leave high school or college, and they don't garner that much interest or knowledge in civics or history, how
Hmm.
exactly does this impact someone once they're past that time and are just living their life?
Well, this kind of goes into the previous question. There isn't an immediate impact.
Mhm.
Unlike math and science, if you don't know how to read, it it can be very difficult for you to do everyday jobs. Um, when it comes to civics and history, again, that's more of a long term issue. How you vote is probably the most important of the great impacts that education regarding history and civics can have on someone. And that can impact their personal life. Like I said, it impacts the government, and government impacts people. Um, and there's also the issue of social cohesion, where people don't really have a shared, if they're not taught history, how can we have a shared history? How can we have a shared past that we all look up to, that we all revere, that we all view each other as compatriots? And that can alienate Americans from each other. Oh, I don't really view you because you have some difference in political belief. You must be some foreigner. You must be some alien to me and my political beliefs, even though we're both American. And so, how we treat each other, how we view each other, and the impact on the government and that reciprocal relationship with the government impacting us is the um, greatest effect that a lack of education can have. Again, it's not. This is part of, maybe it's part of the reason why people nowadays are mostly focusing on the more practical, because they want immediate results. They don't want long term. They don't want to wait for the results. And yet that's not a good thing in the long run. And that's kind of what we're experiencing now. I mean, for the past 30, 40, 50 years, history education has been on the decline when it comes to what is being tested and what is the expectations of what Americans know. Again, I didn't like the standards in the past. They weren't good standards, but
Mhm.
they were better than today's standards, and it's certainly not to the point where I would like them to be. So again, this is part of the challenge that you and I have: is how do we convince people to care about the subject when there's no immediate benefit to the subject? And that's a very difficult thing to try to convince. And I think a lot of people trying to go like, oh well, it's about knowing your history. Like, yeah, that's important and all that. But knowing something doesn't mean that it will guarantee a certain impact, a certain benefit to knowing that information. Again, that's like the trivia thing, like knowing all the presidents, that doesn't mean anything. Knowing their agendas, their political agendas, knowing how they interacted with Congress, what bills Congress passed, and all that stuff, and seeing how that impacts today, like all the regulations and Supreme Court decisions that impacts today, and what people are interested in. So it's a very long term issue, and you have to convince people to think in terms of long term, which is not something that people do nowadays. People have like the memory of a senile goldfish with Alzheimer's. Like as soon as they see like no benefit to something, they just forget it, even though that could have a benefit in the long run. And so trying to convince people to think in the long term is probably the most difficult part when it comes to trying to convince people to care about American history. And so yeah, I think that's part of the issue.
Gotcha. Thank you. So, yeah, no, and I 100% agree with you with that. I feel like there are a lot of things that are declining in regards to the ability to teach history to people. I feel like a lot of students maybe don't see the topic as interesting or as invigorating as some other things, but it's just as important as math or science. And kind of leading into this next part I want to talk about, I feel like there are some ways on various levels from government to teachers to resources where this can be improved. So,
oh, I do want to say real quick.
Yeah, of course.
A lot of the more, I guess, elderly people, they are always getting more interested in history and in civics. Maybe it's because they are nostalgic for the past when they were children, maybe. But I see a lot of people who are older who regret not learning history when they were younger. So if you're a young person right now, like you and I'm 24. I don't know how old you are, but our generation, a lot of us, we don't care about history. I do, but our generation, a lot of it,
Yeah.
a lot of us don't. And they're going to regret that in the future when they're older, because we see the older people today are regretting not having learned it 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. So keep that in mind. Anyone who's our age or younger, keep that in mind that, this might be something that you will be interested in the future, and you'll regret not learning it today.
Exactly. All right, cool. So, exactly. So going into my next part, just generally talking about solutions to this, like what can be done. So firstly, kind of going in at the most basic level, teaching, for example, how teachers can push that information towards students in new ways. What are some ideas that you might have about, how can they make a topic like civics or history more engaging or appealing to students that might not be interested at the get-go?
Yeah, so for the younger levels, for like elementary, middle, maybe the start of high school, having engagement is the most important part instead of just reading and reading and reading. I mean, that's what I like to do. I like to do a lot of reading. I can understand why a lot of people in elementary school and middle school might not like that. So engagement and trying to get people connected with history. So I have a lot of connections with history. One of my ancestors was on the flagship of the Winthrop fleet, the Arabella, with John Winthrop. And so there's a very important primary source document that comes from that voyage called Christian Charity, where we get the phrase, a city on a hill. That's a very important phrase when it comes to American, I guess, self-identity, how we view ourselves throughout American history as a city on a hill for other countries, as an example for other countries. And Reagan would add the word shining city on a hill. So a lot of people confuse the two. And so I've that connection. And then his descendants fought in the American Revolution. I have an ancestor who died at Valley Forge, so I have a connection with the American Revolution in that respect. I have ancestors who came throughout all different time periods of American history, some German who came over in the middle of the 1800s. So that is also an important time period for me. Some came after World War I. I have some Turkish ancestors as well. And so I look at these connections to history and me personally. And I think that we need to encourage that in our youth. Be like, hey, you might have an ancestor who was at a certain event. Maybe you have an ancestor at the Boston Tea Party, or maybe you have an ancestor who fought on the side of the Union in the Civil War. So trying to engage the younger generation and like asking them, hey, look through and ask your family if they have any ancestors who might have participated in an important American historical event. So drawing that connection between the more abstract American history to the personal relationship with students, I think can definitely help engage a lot more students in being interested in wanting, like having this interest and care of American history. So personal engagement and this familial tradition, or whatever you want to call it, might be a good way to do that. Another way is to have students in the classroom talk about these ideas, like the causes of the American Revolution. Maybe you separate the classroom. One side can be Parliament, the other side can be the colonies, and you say, oh, okay, this side that's Parliament, you have all the power, you can dictate whatever you want. What do you want to dictate to the other side? And then you ask that side, all right, how do you feel about Parliament dictating all these things to you? Like, oh, I feel bad. I don't like all these taxes and regulations and all this stuff. Well, that is kind of how our founders felt, with Parliament passing a bunch of these duties and these regulations and these taxes and whatnot. And so trying to engage people so that they can feel what these historical figures felt during these important historical time periods. So a lot of engagement, especially for the younger ages. When it comes to the more mature, older ages, end of high school into college, a lot of reading, a lot of primary source documents. I've read thousands and thousands of primary source documents, and all the documents that I've read, I add to the website, which I'll be showing you in a minute. And so there's a lot of reading that needs to be done. And when it comes to that, there isn't enough time in a semester or in even a doctorate's career to read all these documents, unless that's what you really want to do. If it's just an elective, if it's just part of a core curriculum, it's not really the main interest of a student, it's impossible to expect them to read all these documents. And so we have to choose which documents are the key, like cornerstone documents of American history that gives a somewhat, I don't like the term overview, but you can't go into too much detail, but we have to find the documents, and you have to find the events and the historical people that represent American history. George Washington for the American Revolution, and then his presidency, John Adams, the founding generation. That's a good group, but we can't just teach that. We can't just teach the founding and then skip to the modern day and expect students to understand and know how, like, all that other history in between and how that impacts today. We have to teach all of American history. That's one thing that I didn't like about the education that I got. And I got a really nice education. I went to private schools, and so I got a decent education, and I'm disappointed with it, knowing, now that I've gone back and done all the research and still doing a ton of research, I'm disappointed with what I got. And I know people who went to public schools, got many volunteers at our charity who are public school teachers, and looking at their curriculum, looking at what they have to read and teach, it's just abysmal at the moment. But even for private schools, it's not all too much better. And so there's a lot of room for improvement. And I hope that the work that I'm doing will get more people to be able to research American history in its entirety, not just these, pockets of history. Like when I was taught history, they taught like the American Revolution, and then they skipped to like Jackson, and maybe they mentioned some things like the Indian Removal Act, and then they skipped over to the Civil War, and then they skipped over to, maybe they mentioned Teddy Roosevelt for the Progressive Era, and then they skipped to FDR, and then they skipped from FDR over to the more modern day, like Bush Sr. with the collapse of the Soviet Union, or Reagan with the Reaganomics. And that's like pretty much it from what I was taught. And I went to, again, decent education. There's so much history that's being left out. All the presidents are being left out pretty much. And all of the impact that they all had is also being left out. Like, I wasn't taught the antebellum era, apart from Andrew Jackson, but he wasn't the entirety of the era. I wasn't taught Reconstruction. Like, not just, Reconstruction happened. I was taught that, the dates, and the name of the era. But what was Reconstruction? Well, you have Reconstruction Acts, you have the Enforcement Acts, you have the Civil Rights Acts, you have the Black Codes, which would become Jim Crow in the South. You have all these different things happening during Reconstruction. You have the first Great Depression, which historians now call the Long Depression, from 1873 to 1879. That had a major impact. You have women's suffrage is going on at this time, starting up. You have the temperance movement, which will become prohibition. You have all these different movements going on, and yet I wasn't taught any of it. We just skimmed over, like, Reconstruction happened after the Civil War, and that was pretty much it. And so college, even the college level education today, is missing so much. And I think part of what is missing when we ask students, like, are you interested in history? Of course they're not going to be interested in history because they don't know it. How can you be interested in something that you have no knowledge of? And so we need to encourage more education regarding history, and then we can see if students are actually interested in it or not. So it might be the case that students are very interested in history, but they wouldn't know that they're interested if they're never taught it in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, exactly. I 100% agree with you in the sense that I also think the reason why either so little is covered in regards to history is also just like that semester block where you only have so much time to go over so much stuff. So you either get snippets and details of the most important things, or you get such a broad view of all of history to where it's not very helpful when you're leaving that class, in which I know my public high school, for example, has now started doing things where now, instead of it just being a semester course of history, it's now like a full year-long course to allow for that engagement, which I think is something that should definitely begun to be more implemented across schools across the nation. I feel like history is something where it's not like math where, you can easily like chunk it down, but like I feel like it's a very long-term subject that requires a lot more attention to it than what's given to it in comparison to other kinds of courses.
Absolutely. And although I would want it to be more than just 1 year. Like, I don't think you can learn all of American history in any meaningful depth in just 1 year. It needs to be a continual process of learning and then reinforcing what you were taught in previous semesters. That needs to be more of where we go in terms of improving education. I don't think simply adding 3 months a semester to history, especially with all the other things that students are expected to do, is not that. I don't think that will be the answer to the issue. Another problem is testing. Students are just overly stressed, and that kind of stress doesn't really help when it comes to building interest. Like, why would you be interested in going into a subject that you're overly stressing about as a kid? Like, you wouldn't really want to be in that industry if you have no experience except being taught the bare minimum basics with a ton of stress. So I do think that we need to relieve a lot of the expectations when it comes to testing from students. But then that brings in the question, well, how do we assess whether or not students are being, learning. And I would question whether or not tests actually assess learning. They assess that a student was told something and then that they can regurgitate it on a test. What does that mean in the long run? It doesn't mean anything because they're just going to forget it after they test. And so I don't think testing is, at least that kind of testing, is the right approach when it comes to assessing history education. We might have to, again, it's a long-term issue. So I don't think that we can just test in the semester and be like, oh, this is what a student knows. Like, no, we don't know if they're actually going to retain that after they leave school. And so, it might be the case that we should just get rid of testing, which will save teachers and students a lot of time to actually learn more material. And then we'll have to wait like a generation, 10, 20 years, to see the next generation of Americans out on the market and the next generation of the electorate to see how they handle the real world and whether or not that education has prepared them for the real world. In this case, the real world of politics, because that's really the only application for every single student is how they vote, which goes into a huge rabbit hole, a very deep rabbit hole when it comes to political interest and bias and all these other things, which just make it even more difficult. And I think that's part of the reason why there isn't that much being done to improve education or to improve civic education, because how you improve civic education can have a major impact on the political party. So there's this political interest to not have education regarding American history and civics to be all that well, because it might impact who votes for them or who doesn't vote for them. So there's a lot of interests that would like to not see education improve, sadly.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, no. So for my next question, because like we talked about before, the teacher has a lot of power, or a good amount of power, about how students are engaged, but local, state, and even federal governments have a lot of influence about how is this information pushed, kind of like we talked about prior, where the No Child Left Behind Act signed by Bush Jr. and the Every Student Succeeds Act signed by Obama. These were very consequential acts signed that impacted education. So kind of going off of that, how could these local and state or even federal governments fix education, or at the very least provide more interest to it and help it improve?
Although there were those important acts passed, the federal government has very little control over the actual curriculum of education. That's mostly done on the state level by the state board of educations, and even especially for the college level, it's done on the college level. That curriculum is created by the professors, for example. And so I think reaching out to the board of education and reaching out to universities is the best way to start that conversation about improving history education. I don't think that we should need to reach out to the federal government all too much, because again, they mostly do funding, like grants or loans, student loans. That's most of what the federal government does. They don't really do too much on the actual material being taught. So I think reaching out to the boards of education, which is something that I have done, and starting a conversation with them about the actual curriculum, what's being taught, and also what resources the state provides teachers, because we can't expect teachers to pay for all the necessary material needed for that kind of engagement. Like maybe they want to engage with students writing something that requires paper. If it's elementary school, that might require crayons or markers, or any kind of physical engagement will be costly and also time consuming. So providing teachers with the funding that they ought to have, which a lot of teachers are underfunded and underpaid. So improving pay for teachers, but also improving the amount of resources that classrooms get. especially for elementary and middle school level. Another thing is textbooks. Textbooks are not a good way to learn. I love reading, but I hate textbooks. I appall them. They are just the worst. So we can save a butt ton of money not buying textbooks and instead buying some other material, or just not buying that in the first place, or just using online free resources like what I'm doing. At all the primary source documents that I provide are for free. And so instead of requiring a textbook, which is usually poorly written and has a bunch of historical bias or even just political bias, or is just not well written in any historical context, and is not really a good medium for students to learn, we can start using more free resources that are online. And I don't mean an online textbook. That doesn't solve the problem. And I think that can engage more students, because I don't think textbooks are really that great, and not just in this subject but all subjects. Teaching math from a textbook is not that engaging, and it's also not that inspiring. Students aren't inspired by textbooks, so I'm really anti-textbook.
Gotcha. All right. So yeah, no, awesome. So the last question I had was generally just factors outside of those, like charities such as yours and other public resources, and assets that might not be within the control of the school or those governments. And how could those sources, the ones that aren't really traditionally used, help with teaching history, teaching social studies, teaching civics?
Yeah, well, one, it's free, so that's a huge improvement right there. Two, it's usually more engaging. I know you learned about me and my charity through Mr. Beat live stream that I had with him, and the work that he does is phenomenal. Like, I was in high school I started high school in 2015, and I started watching his Supreme Court briefs, and that helped me through the civics courses that I took. I took AP Gov in high school, and then I also took a bunch of civics courses. I took constitutional law and a course on civil rights in college. And his videos he's done like over 80 now, videos on the Supreme Court decisions were definitely very helpful in helping me get, at first, a general knowledge of the Supreme Court decision, and then that helped me when I read the actual Supreme Court decision, because I needed to actually read the full cases in the courses that I took, especially for college. And so that kind of medium of videos of I don't want to say oversimplification, but just it was a very introductory medium that helped me when I went and did the actual research. And so more of those resources, which is kind of what I'm doing, getting more into. So like Mr. Beat, my charity, my channel, and then so many other, especially on YouTube, so many other YouTube historians who actually do good work. There's a lot of YouTube historians who don't do good work, the pop historians, but there are some who do decent work and can help students when it comes to actually studying a subject, or at least introducing them to a subject for them to be better at studying it when they actually get the primary source documents to read. So again, switching from the old method of textbooks and lectures to engagement and videos that aren't lecture format, like what Mr. Beat does, I think that is going to be the future of the broader education, but more specifically when it comes to American history and civics.
Of course. Awesome. Well, that was the last of my questions, but before we go, I definitely want to talk to you more about Tarpeia, for example. So I just want to understand, how does this charity of yours specifically help encourage this civic and historical understanding within schools and, its general purpose?
Yeah, of course. Is it all right if I share my screen?
Of course, by all means.
Present. Entire screen. All right, does this look good?
That looks great.
Awesome. So this is the homepage of Tarpeia, and we have 3 main programs that we got right now. The first one is called the Compendium. And so this Compendium is our repository of primary source documents. We have over 3,000 documents right now. That's probably going to be about 1% of the amount of documents I intend on having on the site. And we divide American history up into 9 eras: the colonial era, revolutionary era, founding era, antebellum, emancipation, progressive, world wars, Cold War, and then modern. And each of these eras are divided into chapters. So let me just pick, let's do Great Depression. Let me show you what one of these chapters looks like. So this is the chapter page for the compendium. Each chapter has its own timeline, which is what you can see here. You can use your mouse to move around. And each of these that you see on the timeline is either a primary source document or an event. Most of them are primary source documents. And so, for example, this is Hoover's inaugural address. And then each of these has a link right here, which if you click on that, this will take you to the full text of the document. So this is the full inaugural address of Hoover.
Interesting.
So let me go back.
All right.
And so this is just a repository in the format, it's like a library in the format of an interactive timeline. And what I like about this application is you can play videos straight from the timeline. So I have all of FDR's fireside chats, so you can actually play this video. I'm not sure if you can hear it. But this is the actual fireside chat, his 6th one on government and capitalism that he made on September 30th, 1934. And then this is from my channel, Tarpeian Archives, where we re-upload archival video and audio, kind of like what you see right here. And we also do narrations of primary source documents. So like if we narrate the full text of a document, that goes to the Tarpeian Archives channel. We have another channel called Tarpeian Summaries, and where we take all of these primary source documents that you see, all the State of the Union addresses, all the inaugural addresses, all the fireside chats, hundreds of Supreme Court decisions. We take all of these primary source documents and we're summarizing them. We have a separate channel called Tarpeian Summaries for that. And so if you want to watch a video on a Supreme Court decision, I've partnered with Mr. Beat, and so I've added his videos, his Supreme Court briefs to the compendium. And if you want to read the entire case, I have the link to that right here. And so we have thousands of these primary source documents that you can see. Again, we have all the fireside chats for FDR. We have hundreds of Supreme Court decisions. We have all of the State of the Union addresses, like this one right here. And so having access to all of these primary source documents, all this information in this format, it's easy access, easy to find these documents. And if it's too difficult using the timeline, you just scroll down a little bit, and then we have a table that you can filter out your search results. So it's a little bit easier to find a document through this method. But we also just have the timeline here that, maybe you just want to look at a certain presidency and maybe learn or find a document that you never heard of before. Like maybe you never heard of the Neutrality Act. Well, there's a bunch of these Neutrality Acts that were passed right before World War II. And so maybe you want to read that. And this can give you a better understanding of where the American mindset was prior to World War II and then compare that to how that mindset changed with the attack on Pearl Harbor. How did that change? In order to know the effect an event has, you have to know what came before the event. So in order to fully understand the tremendous impact that Pearl Harbor had on the mindset, the morale of the American people, you have to know all this prior history. Americans did not want to be in the war at all. And then when that happened, Americans were all on board with the war. And so part of this resource is great for people who want to do their own research, people who want to expand and go on beyond the bare minimum basics that current academia expects them to learn or teaches them. Like, I was never taught the Neutrality Act. I was barely taught the fireside chats. Like, they mentioned it, but in school you never had to actually read any of them or listen to any of them. Well, now you have an opportunity to read and listen to these fireside chats. And this is just one chapter that covers the Great Depression. This covers the Hoover administration, which are these 4 years. And then it also covers the next 2 terms, the first 2 terms of FDR. If we go to the next chapter, we see this is World War II from 1941 to 1945. This is, more inaugural addresses, more speeches. Now you have the Lend-Lease Act. That was a very important act passed. So you need to understand that to understand the relationship that we had with Britain, but also the Soviet Union prior to the war, but leading up and throughout the war. The Lend-Lease was very important. And also our relationship with China. That I was never taught about how we helped China and Chiang Kai-shek and helping them fight the Japanese. I was never taught. I wasn't even taught how the United States supported the Soviet Union. We gave them a ton of money, trillions of dollars in today's money, in aid, in ammunition, in vehicles, in medical supplies, in clothing. That greatly helped the Soviet Union's ability to fight the Germans during World War II. And that was completely lost in my education. And also when it comes to China, we helped China so much against the Japanese, and that history has been lost. And now if we look at today, like what's going on today, we are not friends with China and we're not friends with Russia. We used to have been friends, even though it was, we had a common enemy, the Japanese and the Germans, but we were friends. We cooperated in the past. And part of understanding what is happening today, which is really relevant right now,
Exactly.
is understanding our relationship with Russia. Back then it was the Soviet Union, and also our relationship with China. How do we go from friends to enemies? Well, you have the entire Cold War period that explains that. And so in order to understand today, we have to understand yesterday. And this resource is very useful when it comes to the primary sources and also some of the events. Like I include the Battle of Stalingrad. All right, how did this impact our involvement in World War II? And part of adding the events, even though at the moment, I don't have too much information for the events, like the Battle of Midway is here, Battle of Stalingrad is here, Operation Torch begins there. The reason why I'm adding the events without adding too much information is because I want to give context for the actual primary source documents. So, for example, FDR's fireside chat on the home front, you don't understand this unless you understand the Battle of Midway, or what would become Operation Torch just a month later. So understanding this document requires you understanding what events are going on around that document. And then again, we have thousands of primary source documents, and I've only showed you 2 of the chapters. We have 26 chapters total, thousands of primary source documents, And all this is just one of our programs, which is the compendium. We also have a second program called the curriculum, where we take all of these eras and we make a course just for that era. So we have a course on the colonial era, a course on the revolutionary era, a course on the founding era, so on and so forth. We have 9 courses right now, and all of them are still being curated, still under development. So you have free access to them. They will be paid. You will have to pay for them once we completed our curation of them. But for right now, they're free. You can just look at what we've done so far, which isn't too much. We've been focusing on the compendium, but the curriculum is going to be taking those documents and putting it in a course format as opposed to the repository format of the timeline. A course format which will include quizzes, it will include tests, exams, essays, DBQs, all the things that a course should have when it comes to this kind of material. And so this is kind of what we got going on. So we are an educational nonprofit, a 501c3. All donations are tax deductible. And if you want to see this get finished, I certainly want to see this get finished, then you can support us financially or volunteer. We're always looking for volunteers to help us write summaries, to find more documents, to curate the curriculum even further. And then the third program is called the Praeconium. This will be a family of journals, of academic journals, for us to encourage people to do their own research and then to get published. We're still under development when it comes to that. We're not an academic journal right now, but we intend on becoming one in the future once we get enough support from donors in order to afford the costs of running an actual academic paper, which is a lot more expensive than I thought in the first place when I started. So definitely do your research before you start any of these major projects. For me, I kind of just ran right into the deep end, and it's been fun. It's been fun developing this entire website and this entire charity. But I was definitely a blind man running into the void. And I've just been figuring it out as I go. And here I am now with all this stuff done. So you just do a little bit every day, and over time it adds up to something massive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, 100%. This is an awesome source. I've looked at it when I saw the Mr. Beat live stream, and I've seen it on my own accord when working on some of my projects. It's genuinely a fantastic source, and I think a lot of teachers, for example, or a lot of people that maybe didn't get the proper education while in school or are still trying to like educate themselves could use this source a lot, very well.
Yeah, I certainly hope so. And again, we're still in the startup phase. Even though we have so many documents, we have over 3,000. That's only 1% of what I intend on having on the site. So if you think that what we're doing, what we've done is impressive, then definitely join, definitely become a site member. It's free to become a site member, and definitely donate. It's not free to donate, obviously. And then become a volunteer. You know, any kind of support now while we're still in the early stages of this project will have a tremendous impact in the future. So I definitely encourage anyone in your audience and my audience to contribute.
Yeah, no, of course. Well, that's the end of everything I had planned. I want to thank you again for doing this interview with me. I really do appreciate it. I think we took some very important stuff back with us, so I just want to appreciate that. And I wish you the best of luck with your charity, Tarpeia. It's an amazing source, and I'm sure in the future it's going to be a very big thing that a lot of teachers are going to appreciate using. So,
yeah, I hope so too. And I thank you for the opportunity to speak about the issues of current academia and how we can work towards fixing those issues and improve our understanding and literacy of American history and civics. And I hope to see your channel and your work grow. And so yeah, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much. I hope you have the rest of your day.
All right, thank you. Bye.
Thank you.